My name is Anisha. I am resident director here at the court, but enough about me. This is Melanie Wilson and Nina Segal, co-creators of Cow Deer that you just watched tonight. So I thought that we'd start just at the beginning and talk a little bit about how this came about conceptually and how each of you approached it as artists, because it's such a unique form of collaboration. So could you both speak to that?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So Katie, who sends apologies and can't be here this evening, Katie has been using Foley in her work for a while, and Katie and I have collaborated for a while, and so that's a process that I've gone on with her. And we both, independently actually, in our own work, have become more and more motivated to make work about the climate crisis and now the biodiversity crisis. We kind of formulated a vague sort of plan for how it might, a piece might work, using only sound, only Foley to engage with animals and the more than human, but in a very sort of prototyped way. And then we brilliantly were able to present or make a relationship with the court, and that's when we met Nina.
I'm primarily a playwright, normally working with words, and I'm also an associate playwright here at the court. And so I'd heard about this project. I'd heard that Katie Mitchell and Melanie Wilson were making a show. I think at that point it was just about a cow, or that was how it was presented to me, making this show about a cow that David Byrne, the artistic director here, was very excited by, but also couldn't really explain what it was or how it was going to work, but had said yes to it. And then at some point he came to me and said, look, they're looking for a writer. Would you like to talk to them and be a part of it? Obviously, like I knew Katie's work, I knew Melanie's work. I think it's very rare that you get the opportunity to work on a project where you have such respect for the artists involved, and you also have such amazing lack of clarity about how it's going to work. Like I think, in the most genuine way, I think it's really, really good as artists, as people, to keep being challenged and to keep working on things where you don't know how they will work. You don't know if they will work. I mean, there's like the caliber of the artists involved. I was like, yes, obviously I want to be a part of this. And so we started working together. We did some R&Ds. Melanie and Katie had already sketched out quite a lot of the kind of broad story ideas. And then as a writer, it was a job of kind of coming in and looking at all of the pieces that were floating around and putting them together into a kind of structure that still tried to stay very respectful to the ideals of the project and to decentering the human. And so knowing that we were going to structure this, but we didn't want to overtly structure it into a human-centered narrative.
And actually, because you and Katie started with cow, and then at some point a deer got introduced. So I'm curious about the choice of animals and how organically that came about. And this is a slightly leading question, but I know that there was quite an interesting research process as you sort of built the show. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think so. I'm sure that Katie won't mind me saying, but Katie has a long kind of interest in cows, and is quite fascinated by them and the process of them giving birth. I think she's sort of witnessed that quite a lot on holidays and things, because Katie has such an amazingly forensic interest in sort of dramatic narratives. A cow giving birth is one of those sort of extraordinary sort of narratives. So we sort of, and I think naturally we do have a very, even if we don't have any kind of first-hand experience of cows, I think cows are quite present in our culture, in the sense of they feed us, they're around us. Even if we're city dwellers, they, we have an understanding of what a cow is. But what we realized is that in order to tell the story of an animal, you have to tell the story of its place, and therefore what are the other animals that are involved in that place, in that landscape. And so that's how we landed on the deer. And I suppose these two animals tell the tension in the stories that we have with different types of animals. So the cow exists, especially the Holstein Friesian cow that is our cow, exists and has been bred genetically to provide milk for us, and its anatomy is optimized for that. And the deer lives despite us. It's sort of clinging on in the bits of wild land that we leave for it. And so and they live cheek by jowl. So each in their own way, they're occupying a slightly different place in the human, non-human relationship kind of matrix. And I think also because deer, we don't really see them very much other than when they're squashed on the road or I live in Manchester, so I go up and down the M6 every now and again, and I see deer at the side of the motorway. They've become very either squashed or very habituated to that sound, and therefore eating. There's even like deer beware signs on the M6. It's really terrifying on their behalf. So yeah, these kind of two protagonists, I think, enable us to tell the story of our relationship with wild animals and domesticated animals, and also the story of the landscape that they live in. So you'll have heard there's a lot of anthropogenic sound, there's a lot of planes and cars and farm machinery, and they live in that soup of our making. They're very impacted by the noises that we make. Is that fair?
There's the first moment where the plane flies over, it sounds so unbearably loud. It's so the notes, the way that you kind of pull at different things at different times really creates really interesting perspective. And I think, what was that? What was researching this like? What was the how did you build this world and these? I was going to say people. These animals.
Yeah. Well, I think this. I mean, I think it's really right. The kind of quotes around like wild animal for the deer, because I think that we initially came into it with the idea that there would be this big distinction between the cow's existence, which is very enclosed and prescribed by humans, and the deer's, which would be something else and would have a certain amount of freedom. And one of the first processes that we did as a team of collaborators was to map out how we imagined the sort of space of the project and how we imagined the terrain that these two animals would inhabit. And while the deer does have a lot more freedom to move, it's still extremely hemmed in to what in our imagining is 1.5 miles, a couple of miles squared. And then there's roads and there's motorways and there's things that are impassable, and there's too much humanity to really get that sense of freedom that we imagine. So it was interesting to like look at these two creatures that seem to have very different existences, but then increasingly they were both very hemmed in. Because deer are still more wild than cows, the research process, it was a lot easier to access cows. So we spent a couple of days down at a cow farm in Pembrokeshire. Katie and Mel both had much more rural upbringings than I did. I am very much like born in a city, lived in a city, had never really encountered a cow up close, and then spent 2.5 days on this cow farm just engaging with the cows and just watching them and listening to them and really pushing against the urge that I had to be like, I need to ask the farmer this, I need to do and be like, no, I'm not there is a certain amount of research about like what is the cow's daily routine, but also just it was the first step in this process of being like, the job here is to listen. And like as a writer, I mean, maybe some writers, but I think generally we're not like naturally listeners. I think we do like to speak. And so it was the first step in being like, okay, this project is about listening to nature. This project is about being still. And it was really interesting just how noticing for the first time on that trip how much all of the humans, except maybe Melanie, because you were extremely practiced at this listening, wanted to fill the silence and wanted to tell each other what the cows were going to do or point out to each other what the cows were doing, and actually just learning to sit in a field for a good amount of time engaging with them. The deers, if you go to like Richmond Park, there's a lot of deer there, but they're not they are sort of their own kind of semi-zoo creatures. So we didn't get so up close to the deers. But I think in terms of like the research process, we really tried to stick to the facts of what might happen to these creatures and not embellish it and not push it in certain directions for the sake of narrative. And so the process of like structuring it, a lot of it was just what would a deer and a cow be doing at this point in the day? And once you fill in the realities of what might be happening to them, there's a little bit of room for maneuvering it towards what will be like an hour experience for an audience. But generally, it's a process of filling in the gaps from what the reality of those animals' lives is. And a lot of it is eating and listening and shitting and urinating and themselves just listening to nature. So it becomes this sort of meta listening where we are listening to them and they're listening to their environment.
My last question is slightly big, sorry, but it's about eco-theatre and eco-feminism and what it means to make a piece of theatre that sort of decenters loads of structures. So whether that's sort of artistic hierarchies or the patriarchy or just what being a person is. It's very interesting to watch the incredible choreography of the performers, but it's all in service of sort of this, as you say, day-to-day, narrativeless type of existence. So could you speak to a little bit about just the philosophy of this show and what it means to make a piece of theatre about the climate crisis?
I suppose there is a possibility for a feminist kind of framing for this type of listening, and this is available to everyone, and it might not be called feminism to everyone, but it's about listening to, making space for, or trying to tune into the voices that can't be heard or are yet to be heard, and sort of making space to kind of draw them out or to give them room to emerge. So that sort of guiding principle of what do ants sound like, or what does a mouse sound like as it goes through a hedge, the commitment to the inquiry, to the imaginative labour, is sort of part of the politics of it, and something that it feels very, in some ways, very simple, very straightforward. I'm sure many of you go out for walks and this is kind of very familiar, some of these sounds, but actually the action of making this and all of us coming here and looking and listening to this is absolutely ginormously radical, because the culture that we make for ourselves is about ourselves, and we've never really made stories about animals that don't anthropomorphize them or kind of require them to operate in certain symbolic ways or mythic sort of ways. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there is another type of imaginative labour that we need to do. Labour makes it sound kind of intense, but it's actually quite a joyful exercise, a journey that we could go on together to imagine a different type of relationship with other creatures. And we need that because of the climate crisis and because of the structures that don't work for us, for our ecosystems, for our food networks, for human rights, for all of these structures that encode oppression or exploitation, they apply across life forms, actually. So this opportunity to make this world of like tiny micro scale, as well as this macro scale of imagining, is a sort of one way of our proposal of just thinking differently about what the future could be like. That was a rather large answer, but I don't know how you feel or would like to add.
It sometimes feels like there's a sort of communication failure around the climate crisis, and that sometimes that extends to theatre. And I think people have tried with varying degrees of success in various directions to try to bring the enormity of this issue into the theatre space. I think often those efforts are in the direction of like, there's so much information and we're worried that it will be boring. And so we will make like a sexy scientist who's going to be telling their lab assistant. And I think that is just kind of piling more distraction on top of it. And I think that what really appealed to me about this project is it just feels like paring it back to just the specificity of this and saying we are going to pay attention for this 1 hour to this, and we are going to practice a kind of listening, and we're going to practice a kind of attention. I think it's really interesting that like I think sometimes people find it kind of confronting to be asked to just listen, or they get anxious about it. I think that on lots of levels, like practicing listening and being better at listening, it sounds like a platitude, and I guess it kind of is, but I think it's really important to go like, why do we find it confronting to be told that this narrative is not about us? Why do we find it confronting to be told that our only job here is to like listen? I think that this piece kind of takes the scale issue of a crisis that is so large that it feels uncontainable to an hour or 3 hours or 4 hours on a stage of whatever size, and goes, okay, so let's just look at this one part of it and let's take and just try to focus on that as much as possible. And I think people will get, will take different things away from it, but I think we've spoken to a lot of people who say that the show has a resonance beyond this hour. And I know that definitely for myself, like we've been in this room for like 4 weeks sitting in the dark, and it tunes your hearing differently. And so I hope that continues on past the show and continues into the world where the sounds that you will hear are not being made with field recordings and humans manipulating Foley objects, but are actually the real environment and creatures around you.
Maybe another thing to add to that also is the role of the Foley artist in this work. So it's really different to the way that Foley operates usually when Foley is a kind of moving image art form, and how it kind of also operates in theatre, in other contexts. Certainly in the context that Katie and I might have used it, it's always been in service of a live camera kind of setup. But here, I suppose we feel like the Foley artists are extraordinary technicians and extraordinary dancers and musicians, but they also have this role of stewardship. They are stewarding the presence of these animals through the materials into being, and that kind of role of stewardship, of that careful, diligent, tender kind of holding of the possibility of the animal, of the body of the animal, I think has a lot to do with what might be possible for us more broadly if we steward an alternative relationship with other beings, or we are more sort of tender and almost, collegiate, I suppose. Fellow travellers, I think, is a way that some people describe it as. So yes, the role of the Foley artist is also part of the proposal of the the piece. Not only are they the executors of it, they are also a possible version of human stewardship.
Does anyone have any questions for Mel and Nina? Hello. So that question is, how did you gather the sounds and how did you piece them together for the show?
Thank you. Yes. So, yes, there was certainly a lot of recording during that trip. But to be honest, this is what I've been up to for my summer holidays. I've been in Oxfordshire, North Devon, South Wales. You know, I've been in different places around the country. Although we didn't see deer. Well, I actually did see a deer in North Devon, and I sort of followed her along a particular kind of track, recording the environment that she was in. And I had Nina with me in the form, because by that time Nina had kind of sketched the story outline. And so I was then researching these different environments that we needed to capture, that Nina had kind of indicated and that we discussed wanting. And, you know, being out for hours or getting up very, very early or staying out at night to capture these environments, and as much as possible trying to be very faithful to the creatures that were in that she would have heard. And then, yes, of course, there was many emails to colleagues saying, do you have the sound of a cow in labour? Because I didn't manage to get that, because we were there now is the moment that cows are kind of producing calves. So I had some help with some recordings that others had. So there was a sort of collaging of that, but as much as possible. I mean, obviously there's things like the plane that goes by. That's not a field recording. That's a field recording with a plane inserted. So that's our dramaturgical decision. But yeah, it's a process of field work, really, of research. And this project I probably actually began that a few years ago with the beginnings of capturing some of the environments. So yeah, it's a long process.
I smiled when the jet went overhead, because my parents in their early retirement lived on the edge of a valley where the RAF could practice low flying below the radar on the top of the hill behind. And I have observed cows not react to it, carry on munching. Couple of questions. As someone who is completely urban, as I said, my parents retired to the country. Everything I heard was explicable. And one of the things I found about visiting my parents was, what the hell was that noise? And there's things that I could not work out what they were. And then, so did you think about bringing in anything inexplicable? And then the other question is, cows, definitely, deers to a lesser extent, are herd animals, and we only heard one of each. Did you think about doing herd work?
There is herd work, sir, but unfortunately you are not in the great herd position. These lovely people here up this side would have heard the herd.
You're at the front of the herd.
Yeah, the speakers are all around. But I suppose research in the final hours, the final kind of half day that a cow goes into labour, she separates herself from the herd. So you can hear some munching and some coughing of the herd in the distance, but actually she has separated herself. So we're trying to be quite accurate about what her movements would be. There is another deer that she encounters very briefly at the beginning in the forest. But again, in August, female deer, if they're just a year old, which our deer is, don't breed. So they're sort of get back kind of posture to other deer. So yeah,
There is a whole backstory.
Does that include anything inexplicable?
Oh, what, in terms of the sounds? I think I love that every sound to you is explicable. I think that speaks to the work that's been done, and also to your own listening and attention, and in the best way, like confidence about what you're hearing. I think what Melanie's done so beautifully is like holding people in the confidence that they can understand what they're hearing, because a lot of those sounds, if you haven't spent a huge amount of time in nature, if you are from a city, you may not have ever heard before. So you don't have a kind of, oh yes, that's the sound of the amniotic sac rupturing. But I hope that there is a kind of holding of the audience through the process, so that when that sound comes, you can recognize it, even if you haven't ever heard it before. But yes, the deer has a whole backstory about her family and her sisters, and where they have all split off into the different counties just prior to this summer.
On the explicable thing, it's related, not exactly inexplicable, but there's a wood pigeon quite close to the beginning of the piece, I think in scene 2 or 3. And some people think it's an owl, and then they get very sort of thinking, oh, are we in a nighttime context? And that's completely fine, because wood pigeons and owls do sound quite similar if you're not familiar with them. This sort of lovely unpicking that's the potential of, which is kind of innate in the work, which, you know, if you buy the playtext, you can see.
I think it'd be also an interesting experiment if you're at your parents' house again to listen for an hour with the intention of understand, because I wonder if the inexplicable sounds are because you're sort of in conversation or doing something else, and then a sound comes through and you haven't maybe been following the thread of what's around it.
Was the staging and the way that you presented the show, were those conversations always led by sound, or did you ever think about the sort of visual legibility of?
Yes, they're always led by sound. So this is essentially a Foley studio. This is kind of what it looks like. So this is the definite moment to give a lot of props to our Foley originators, Ruth Sullivan and Tom Espiner, who Ruth was the deer and Tom the cow. So they are Foley artists. That's their jobs, alongside being actors themselves. And so all of these props and materials, instruments, if you like, were led and suggested by Tom and Ruth as being the right materials to make the sounds that we wanted. The only capitulation is the red balloon with the, I think I'm allowed to say that, is with the amniotic, with the head of the calf coming out and the sac bursting. The colour of the red balloon is somewhat helpful, but apart from that, it's all kind of authentic Foley practice. Obviously, the presentation of it to you in this way is theatrical. But actually, this type of layout, the microphones, the height of things, that's all very much as you would find in a Foley studio.
It's all very, very functional. And I think, with the exception of the balloons, often when a choice came up of we could make the sound like this and it would look more like the thing, or we could make it like this. The decision was always made in terms of, it's not about looking, it's about what's going to sound the most like it. The performers that we have are incredible Foley performers, all of them, and there's a certain amount of embodiment, I think, that happens. But again, that is to get the correct sound of the hooves. That's never to
Be the animal.
Yeah, it's not playing the cow. It's just that is the way that your weight needs to go and the way that you have to move your body in order to get the correct sound. But there are moments when it lines up visually, and I think there is a pleasure in that, but it's sort of secondary to the making of the sound.
I suppose it's a question about sort of what the political impact of a piece of work like this might be, or whether you have any interest in sort of pushing this sort of work into a more interventionist space?
I suppose we're not experts. I mean, we're experts at making performance, but we're we're not politicians or policymakers, but we occupy the same role that you do. We're all a part of society, all of whom have the same kind of voice. So you're absolutely right. It is sort of available to all of us to ask for frog bridges or nature corridors, or to write to our MPs. And I know that feels like a hopeless thing, but I suppose it's an invitation for us to go out and perhaps all of us to sort of take this stewardship role on, to do the things that we can do, you know, put Swift boxes on the side of our house, or maybe consider, I'm not a vegan, but maybe consider eating less dairy. I don't know, that's not for everyone, but you know, there are things that we can all do. However, I wouldn't want to suggest that we have to do it all. Absolutely, our politicians and our policymakers have to be accountable, and they have to do that work with us. But I'm not sure if we've really thought about this being a call to arms, other than to each other, I suppose, and what might be possible for all of us to go out into the world and listen.
I think the process was so focused on like decentering humans that in a very genuine way, I'm not sure it ever crossed any of our minds, like which humans do we need to then get into this room to see it. But it is a really interesting proposition, because I think we've already seen with certain audience members that there are certain audience members who may not be open to, or might actually be quite closed off to, a show about the climate that they feel is more explicit or more overt, or what they feel is like polemical. I think that this show takes quite a like broad church way in to it, but we have not currently invited anyone, and now the show is very sold out, and I would not want an actual human audience member to not be able to see it, so that a politician could see it.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Nina, to Mel, to Katie, who couldn't be here, to the whole team, and to you for staying. I hope you all have a lovely night. The end.